In this video, we're going to cover the Scandinavian defense, whereby black meets white's e2, e4 with the thrust d7, d5. We're going to cover introductory theory, as well as 7 of the common pitfalls or traps that white could fall into. And with his first move, black is already determining the opening. He's saying, let's play my way. So the first question is this the best way to counter white's e2, e4? Well, the best opening is the one you know better than the other guy. That being said, d7, d5, the Scandinavian defense, is played at top grandmaster level. It's also played at amateur level, and it's an interesting opening. But again, the best opening is the one you know better than the other guy. But wait a minute. Let's say that we just want to play the old-fashioned way. What's wrong with just pushing e7 to e5? Is there anything wrong with that move? Well, actually, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, and it's probably a grandmaster's choice ahead of our selected opening, the Scandinavian defense. In my opinion, e7 to e5 is a great way for masters to play and a great way for ranked beginners who are under 1400 to play, but not for players in between. If you haven't played 200 chess games with e7, e5 after e2, e4, then you probably should not be playing the Scandinavian defense yet. So let's talk about what might be wrong with this very natural way of countering white's e2, e4. The first thing I would say that's wrong with it is it's probably exactly what white was hoping for you to do. Sure, any player who opens with e2 to e4 should be ready for all sorts of answers, Sicilian defense, Pirc defense, French, you name it. But the thing he's probably most hoping for is to play is your e7, e5 reply. So with this point number 1 being you're playing exactly into white's hands. Point number 2, because you've put a pawn on the 4th rank, white can offer all sorts of gambits because he can already reach your pawn. He can play a Danish gambit. He can play a King's Gambit, all sorts of things. And again, if you know what you're doing, you could probably learn how to meet all of these things quite well. But it just makes your opening preparation that much more difficult as the player with the black pieces. The ability for white to reach your pawn with another pawn, a pawn lever, and already start opening the game with the gambit. That's point number 2. Point number 3, both sides have put out a pawn which is undefended. But white being first, he can already develop with an attack on your pawn and lead the play. Here, white plays knight to f3, attacking your pawn. Sure, you can meet it, but it's going to be white who's going to be leading and holding the initiative. He attacks your pawn with a developing move, and you can defend it with a very nice developing move. Now, white could continue the attack on this pawn with another developing move, bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez, threatening to take off the knight, and then the knight would be able to capture this pawn. Once again, if you know what you're doing, you can meet these things quite well. The natural instinct would be to defend with a pawn, like this, which has 2 drawbacks. First of all, you're limiting this bishop right here to just 1 square of movement. And second of all, you've now had your knight pinned against your king. These are things we may not want. Let's go back and see another point behind this type of opening. And that may show best when white plays the Gioco Piano, or the Italian opening. In this type of a position where both sides have advanced their e-pawn 2 squares, this bishop has a nasty look right here at f7, which is the weakest point, the weakest pawn in black's camp, because it's only defended by his king. And there's a lot that happens. Sometimes the queen could be here, and the 2 of them could join in on this point. Or a knight can move right over here and attack on it. Or this pawn could move 2 squares like in a King's Gambit style, and after castling, the rook could be attacking f7. So attack on f7 is very hard to meet. For example, after this normal developing and attacking move, white already has an attack, a very nice one, against the f7 point. Once again, if you know what you're doing, you can handle all these things, but there's a lot to learn, and there's all sorts of sacrifices and attacks that happen against the f7 point because this bishop has such a nice look straight down at this point right here. And for all these reasons, chess players have come up with other ways of playing. This one here about the bishop and this whole diagonal in particular against the attack against f7, there are actually three different openings, three different defenses that black uses against pawn to e4, where he moves this pawn only one square, just to here. If he does it right away, that's called the French defense, if he does it on move 1. But there are two other openings where this pawn ends up just going to this square right here. In the French defense, as I said, it happens right away. And in the Caro-Kann defense, which begins with pawn to c6, this move comes in a bit later after this bishop gets somewhere outside of the pawn, so it's not blocked in. In the French defense, the bishop is blocked in, but in the Caro-Kann defense, this move will not be played until the bishop gets outside. Same thing with our Scandinavian defense. So let's take a look at those. Just very quickly, the French defense begins like this. White takes the center, why not? And black counters right away with a pawn to d5. And all three of these defenses we're about to discuss briefly. There's a pawn on d5, which is going to attack or ask a question to the pawn on e4. In our Scandinavian defense, it's right away on move 1. And the French defense, it's on move 2. And in the Caro-Kann defense, it's on move 2. Notice the bishop is free to get out in the Caro-Kann defense, and it's also free to get out in the Scandinavian defense. So another interesting point about these three openings, let's go back and look at this again. In the French defense, after the first two opening moves, white has three decent choices. He can swap, he can push forward, trying to bind black, or he can just defend the pawn where it stands. All three are often seen. And in the Caro-Kann defense, after the d5 push comes in, white again has three choices: swapping pawns, advancing to cramp, or just simply defending the pawn where it stands. In our Scandinavian defense, we hit the pawn right away without preparing with a pawn push, which has certain pluses and minuses, because we're going to have to recapture with our queen and lose time, whereas in the French defense and the Caro-Kann, they don't have that problem. They have other problems, though, one of them being that white has three different ways to choose from that are all pretty good. Now, you might say in the Scandinavian defense, wouldn't white also have the same three choices? To swap, to push forward, or to defend with something? Technically he does, but the two moves other than capturing right away are far inferior. So the most commonly seen move is to take the pawn and for black to recapture the way we've shown here. We'll look over those other choices a little bit later, what could happen. So now let's take a look. Once again, we play d5, and right away we're asking white, what are you going to do about this pawn? We're going to go over move 2 alternatives, but for right now we're going to take a look and see what happens when he captures and why he captures. He captures because he's opening the center. A great thing to do when you're white and you're already ahead in development, because it makes your pieces more active when the center pawns are missing versus when they're locked or still in place in the center. Not only is white first to move and opening the game already, he has a natural way to gain one more move against the black queen. He can play his knight to c3 and ask the queen, where do you want to move to? And now he'll be even one move further ahead in development. But let's take a look at that. Because before white plays knight to c3, he may choose to do something else. The queen is in a very unfortunate spot where white can get a productive move in, possibly by building a pawn center, putting pawns here and here, and chasing the queen away that way, or he could choose to use his one free smack at that unfortunate queen by doing it with the knight. Both of them have merit, but it makes a little more sense to go for quick development of your pieces rather than building a big pawn center when you're going to try to show black that the game is opening. He's black. He's a move behind. And now he's going to be even further behind after knight to c3. There really is no great reason why black's defense should even work. But it does, and it works well, and as we said, even at the highest levels. We are going to take a look at it because white often will try to play not for knight to c3, but for pawn to c4 and pawn to d4 and build that two-pawn center. That's something he's going to try to do. So let's take a look and see. For reasons we're going to go into in a minute, the best thing for white to do would be to immediately hit this queen with knight to c3. Now, where does the queen go? There are a few choices. Right now, there's a very big style amongst grandmasters just to move the queen right here to d6. That's not going to be the topic of our opening tonight. And another thing that can be is black can bring his queen all the way back to delta 8. And that is also, that's the third most popular option. But as we speak today, the most popular option on all levels of chess is still queen to a5, where it might be a little bit more vulnerable, especially when white develops his bishop to delta 2, already looking to do nasty things to the queen. But other than that, it does a whole lot of strong things to really hurt white, controlling all of these squares straight across, as well as pinning this knight once this pawn moves. Let's get some of these lines off the table here. So now, the best third move for white is knight to c3. Well, what if he wanted to play knight to c3 a move later? Let's just say he wanted to hide his intentions, whether he's going to be playing for knight to c3 or a pawn to c4 idea, and he says, let me just do something else in the meantime. Maybe I'll just do another developing move like knight to f3 or a pawn to delta 4. We'll get to that in a minute. Right now, let's just take a look and see what happens. After knight to c3, we're going to play queen to a5. And now it's time for white's next move. And almost always he's going to play pawn to delta 4 and or knight to f3. At this point, it doesn't make a tremendous difference which one he's going to do. Let's just say he plays pawn to delta 4, because in some cases he holds back on developing the king's knight for quite a while and does other not nice things to black. But for right now, we're going to take a look at this. And now we're going to see what black's plan of development is. Black is going to develop his knight to the most natural square. Now, let's say white develops his knight to f3, which is the most natural square for that knight. And at this point, black's plan is to get this bishop here somewhere outside of the pawn chain before he plays this pawn to echo 6. But as it turns out, it's a great idea, and he could do that right now, but it is a much better idea for, at this point, right now, black to play pawn to Charlie 6, right here, pawn to c6. He could actually have done that instead of knight to f6 a move ago. And the reason is, we want to see where this bishop is going before we make our next move. As a matter of fact, we need this for a bunch of reasons, and one of them is so that the queen has a way to run back to here or to here if it's attacked by something. It could be attacked by this bishop, and sometimes it's attacked by this knight going here and then to there. So now is the right time to play pawn to c6. Let me just remove some of these things. This is the order we'd like to see you do it in. And we'll go over other ideas in just a bit. Now let's talk for a minute about the pawn being here on d4, because this is an important concept. This is where white will usually put this pawn, and it gives him the most room to maneuver behind rather than if he moved it only one square. Another reason he puts the pawn on d4 is because it's a terrific support point for this knight. This knight's going to have a nice home here protected by this pawn, and that's an important part of white's strategy. So there are three reasons why white plays his pawn to d4. One of them is because it gives him the most room behind for his pieces to maneuver. Two is it gives him a support point for his knight. And very importantly is the big plan that white's going to play for if he knows what he's doing. If white doesn't know what he's doing and he's just going to develop his pieces, black is going to have a terrific game. But there are some things that white can do to make life very uncomfortable for black. And one of them is that after we set up our pawns here and here, it makes a little fortress for our king and for our center position. What white would like to do is find a way, and there is a way, without losing material, to push this pawn one more time forward and cause some sort of pawn exchanges, either with the c6 or the echo 6 pawn, exploding our little fortress. These are the ideas behind white's pawn to d4 system. It's important to understand that because there is another system that's much less commonly seen and is potent where this pawn does not go to d4. Let's take a quick look at that, even though I said we're going to do the alternatives later, because this is just such an important concept. And that is where the fourth move for white would be bishop to c4. And what he's doing in this type of system is, well, sometimes he's just going to reach d4 anyway, and with a different move order, but what he also might be doing is playing for this system. Now this looks very modest. He's keeping the pawn back here on d3. And let's just talk for a minute. It's important to understand the pluses and minuses. I'm going to go over some of the minuses first, which are black's pluses. Well, number one, by not having a pawn all the way over here, we've got these two squares here and here for us to use. We can use both of these central squares because white's staying in his half of the board. Secondly, he's not going to have a home for his knight all the way over here because he's got this pawn stuck way back here. And thirdly, he's never going to be doing that d4, d5 push to explode the fortress of pawns that black is setting up. So it seems like a much more timid setup. Now let's talk about what he gains. Number one, with the pawn on d4 over here, it's unprotected, and a lot of black's strategy will be attacking that pawn on the file with rooks and queens and any other pieces he can bring to bear on it. Back here, this pawn is nice and safe. There is no attack that's going to happen. That's number one. Number two, this bishop is protected by something. That matters. A lot of times, black will do tricks based on sliding over here with his queen, maybe giving a check, and he can pick up this bishop. So the bishop is much safer here. Number three, this bishop going here and then maybe here will have a nice long diagonal through the board, not blocked by this pawn like it would be when the pawn is on d4. That's an important thing that comes up. And so there's a lot of piece attacks. And also this knight can use this square to get in really close and do all sorts of sacrifices over here. So this is a double-edged thing. When the pawn only reaches d3, there's a group of pluses for white and a group of minuses for white. Oh, another plus is that this bishop over here, which is a normal place to develop the bishop, it's not really biting on anything like it would be when this pawn is one square forward over here. Then this bishop has a real threat sometimes to take this pawn. Not so. Black kind of can run out of squares in this setup for white. But another drawback to it would be, let's take a look. Let's say this goes here, here, here. If this pin becomes annoying, black can kind of do stuff like this, and not only is this pawn pinned because of the rook over here, this bishop can't come back to help out. So I think we've covered all the things that have to do with the white's d3 setup. Let's go back to our regular opening system, and d4 is the move. Knight f6, knight f3. Remember, we want to play this before we throw our bishop out there. We want to see what setup exactly. Is he going to go for a knight move? Is he going to go for a bishop move? And now, white's strongest move is bishop to c4. That's a bit odd. The only type of player that would put their bishop on c4 in this kind of position is somebody who knows what he's doing or a complete beginner. And why do I say that? Because it should be obvious to white that our system is going to be based on putting a pawn right here on echo 6 as soon as this bishop gets outside somewhere. Let's take a look at that. Let's just say he castles, and now this move. So in a setup like this, which is kind of like either a French setup or a Caro-Kann setup, where the pawn is on e6, this bishop kind of is biting on granite, as we say. It doesn't really have any great place to go. So you'll see in the French defense, most often, white's not going to bother putting his bishop on c4 like he would in an e4, e5 opening. He's probably going to put it back here on delta 3, where at least it has a long shot all the way down here. Let's go back and take a look at that. And yet, this is the move that white most often plays if he knows what he's doing against the Scandinavian defense. Why? Why put a bishop where it's going to have so limited scope? As it turns out, if he puts it here or here, black is going to have a very easy time of it. This move actually does contain two ideas of threats. Number one, it's going to assist this pawn in its future explosion of the black pawn fortress here and here. That's what he's hoping for, and that can happen in many of the lines. And the way that works is this bishop has to be over here. We'll go into that a little bit later. But suffice to say, the bishop on c4 is here for two reasons. One is to assist the pawn in advancing forward and exploding black's fortress. The other reason is that even with the pawn over here, there are a bunch of sacrificial ideas that white is dreaming of. Things like, I'll just make some silly move. Well, let's just say this bishop is no longer here, or it's blocked. He can sacrifice right here already.
Check.
And it's really not pretty, and a lot of times this can lead to an immediate checkmate. So there are sacrifices, even against our solid setup, to an astute player. And they have a lot to do with this bishop being right here. Not to mention that before we get our pawn up, there could be sacrifices right here. Let's take a look at that. And we're going to move right now to trap number 1. It's a trap, it's actually a trap that white is going to fall into. And we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. Now let's talk about it. Now, both sides have played book moves. This is crucial. Now it's time for black's 6th move. Well, before he's going to develop his knight here, and before he's going to push this pawn here, we've got to get that bishop out. The book move, which I am not recommending you play, and I'll get to that in a minute, is to put the bishop right here. Develop here, followed up by pawn to e6. I shouldn't say it's the book move, it's the main book move. It's the move most masters and grandmasters play. There are a very few grandmasters and masters who play their bishop here at this point, pinning the knight. And that's the move I'm going to recommend in this video for a bunch of reasons we're going to get into. Why isn't it considered the main move? And the reason it's not considered the main move is because of this little move right here. Now, black has two crummy choices. If he swaps bishop for knight and the queen recaptures, he's further behind in development because he's giving away a developed piece and developing white's queen, and he's given white the advantage of the two bishops. So, let's say black backs up. Now he can do this, gaining space, and this is considered a slightly better position for white than the usual lines because these pawn advances are gaining space, and since white is not castled short, they don't hurt his castle king position. He is going to castle long, Black is probably going to castle long because these pawns are already marching to the other side of the board. But on the whole, this is considered a plus for white to have this. Slightly. So why am I recommending this move? So there's a bunch of reasons that I happen to like this move. First of all, as I said, it is a grandmaster move. So you are still in book and are playing properly. Number two, if white does something like castle short, this is actually considered the ideal place for the bishop to be, pinning the knight and putting pressure on a key defender of this pawn. Not to mention causing a lot of angst because that pin is going to be in place. So against short castling or against somebody who played bishop to delta 3 instead of c4, this is considered the best move. Thirdly, it's a little lesser known than bishop to f5. So you're going to be throwing white on his original ideas a lot sooner. And lastly, it's a bit trappier. We're going to see that the traps that I'm going to show are going to be based around this bishop to g4 idea. So let's get right to that. Now we've seen how things should start. And this is the development's going to go pawn here. Maybe this bishop's going to go here to try to annoy the black queen once the knight moves out of the way. This knight is going to go here, and then we're going to castle the same direction as white most of the time. So that's the basic idea behind the first 6 moves or so of the Scandinavian defense, the way I'm telling you to play it. Now we're going to go back and see what are we going to do if white doesn't do exactly these moves and chooses alternatives that make a difference. But before we do that, I can't resist showing you one trap idea that is not optional. This trap idea, if you don't know this, you cannot play this system as black. So let's get right to it. This is like trapping the trapper, because right now, for his 7th move, a lot of smart players who are schooled in tactics with the white pieces are going to hang themselves. And it begins like this. And they play
check.
Bishop takes pawn check, king takes, and now the knight comes here, check, forking the king and the bishop. The bishop is protected by a knight, but it's attacked by a queen and a knight. And now, after the king moves here or wherever, the bishop takes, I'll just show you this, the bishop takes the knight, and let's see what has happened here. Black has lost a pawn, castling privilege, and he kind of has a weak pawn position as well, with an isolated pawn right here. So if this works, this opening for black does not. So let's go back and see how can it fail. Let's take a look at that.
Check.
Bishop takes pawn check. The correct move is to take this off. The knight comes
check.
here, and now, surprise of surprises, people won't know what hit them. The correct move that black plays now, that you must know this trap or you cannot play this opening, is queen
check.
takes knight, check. Pawn takes the queen. Bishop takes a queen. And now white has a choice. He can capture this bishop or this knight, whichever one he wants, but he can't take both. Let's say he takes this one. Well, let's just stop right here. Black has 3 minor pieces on the board. 4 minor pieces on the board. And white has 2. He's about to capture 1. Let's say he takes this one. That's it. We move the knight out of the way, and white can resign because black is a piece up. Some players have to scratch their heads and say, what happened here? I'll leave it to you to see the mathematics of why this works out, but there's nothing
Check.
After queen takes knight check, white can resign right away. His whole trap has failed. And whereas he thought he got you burnt, he burnt himself. And this is going to happen in a good number of games, probably, certainly speed games, and probably a few slow games as well. Let's go back to the beginning. Before we get to 6 more traps that I promised in this video, let's go back and take a look and see what things can happen starting from move number 2. What are the most common things that white might want to do if he thinks he's going to throw you a curveball and not play exactly what you want? Probably the one that's most often played is this move right here, which looks like a good idea. I mean, it's a good idea in the Caro-Kann and the French defense, but here it's slightly less of a good idea, because in the French defense, this bishop is trapped. But in our Scandinavian, we can do this before we push that up. So we get an improved version of the French defense advanced variation. And in the Caro-Kann, this bishop could always get out, and this pawn moves once on move 1, and then it would move again to attack the center pawn here. But in the Scandinavian defense, we haven't moved this pawn, so we can do this all in one push. And we probably should do this right now. This might be the best second move, although there's a choice, and you can play whichever one you like. After this move, black can play this, with the idea of just completing his development and then maybe playing c5. Or black can play c5 right away, which might be slightly stronger. The computer thinks the game is equal. White isn't losing, but he had a nice advantage before. And now he's dead equal after just 2 moves, and it may actually be easier to play the black position than the white position. Because what you've done here is you've made it hard for white to get this pawn over here, which is needed to defend this pawn over here. Let me just go back to that again. This pawn is kind of lonely on his half of the board, so he's going to need another pawn to protect him. Either the queen pawn or maybe the f pawn. There are some strong players that play the f pawn. So let's just talk about the general plans for white. There's no way I can show you every single thing that white could do from here or that black has to do to respond from here. This is an opening where you have to know something about chess and chess pawn structures to be able to keep your advantage or equality as black. After this move, if white chooses to play d4, he's going to have that chopped off by a side pawn almost immediately. Even if he prepares it with something like this, knight to c3, we're going to be chopping off that d4 pawn with a side pawn. We're going to be opening the c file for a rook, maybe in conjunction with the bishop here. We're going to get a bunch of good things. So for that reason, after c5, white might figure he wants to protect his pawn with the f pawn push. Now we're not going to do anything. He might leave his d pawn at home or move it just one step. So there is some logic to this f2, f4 push. But the drawback to this is the f-pawn push develops nothing, and it kind of weakens up the king position, sometimes along this diagonal and sometimes along that diagonal. And what black might do is use this square right here for his knight, protected, and play a move like this so that white won't be able to kick it out with a move like that. There's a lot to go over. You can practice this with a computer. You can look it up. We can make a whole video on what to do after 2e5. But suffice it to say, there's nothing great about this move at all, and certainly nothing to fear. In the very worst case, you could just play an immediate French defense, but there's no reason to do that. You could play something like this, and after that, something like this. Play Michael, something like that, and we're certainly not worried about this. We're fine with this. If he wants to double our pawns, we can bring another pawn. There is actually one trap I've seen in this system. trying to remember how that went exactly. Yeah, something like this. And now there's an attack on this bishop and a double attack here. This is like I think the one way that black could get burnt in this. And all you would have to have done is earlier get your queen over here or a rook over here, so that when this comes up, all you have to do is just swap over here. All right. Let's go back now and see other second move options besides the take. So besides the push, there is the defense of the pawn with a move like this. And this is pretty harmless. You have a couple of choices. Some people like to just push straight through, knock the knight back, and then support that pawn with another pawn. That's a perfectly good way to play, and it's the computer's choice. But if you're a Scandinavian player, you might prefer to do something like this. And now we're going to make the same setup as a Scandinavian defense. Bishop on the same diagonal, knight here, other knight here. Except we haven't lost any time with our queen. So we're a little better than we are in a regular Scandinavian. And another option from here that you might like, and actually is the computer's choice, if you're not pushing, instead of attacking him with the bishop, you could attack him with the knight right away. And if he doesn't want to lose any time, he has to take.
Check.
This is one of the occasions where you're going to take away from the center because it helps develop. And we're just going to develop our pieces in this system. And everything should be fine. You can make a Scandinavian type of c6 move if you like. There's nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about at all after white plays 2 knights to c3. And let's see what other choices there are. There's the black Mardimer gambit. This actually has some real point to it. White says, I'm not defending this pawn, I am gambiting this pawn. So right away realize if you wanted to, you could play French defense by a different move order. You could play the Caro-Kann defense. Or you can do what I do. I don't want to let him have his exact setup that he wants. After this, white usually plays here. And then he gambits the pawn. He wants you to take, developing his knight and opening the f-file. And this is not considered a fantastic way for white to play, but people who know their black Mardimer gambit are going to burn you with it. I am not going to play into this gambit. What am I going to do? I'm going to push the pawn forward, let him take it off, and then I'm going to go into my Scandinavian setup as per usual. Pawns here, bishop outside the chain, knight over here, the other knight, and this bishop wherever I think it belongs. And what have I got here? Well, he's moved his f-pawn, which is not a great thing to do, and it's sitting on the f3 square. Sad that we didn't swap and bring out his knight. Now his knight can't go to the best square possible, and this is a system that works for me quite well, and you can play it as well. And there's only one other move I've seen from here, and this looks completely crazy, and it's a gambit that goes this way. And this is an awful gambit. The computer hates it. You take the pawn, and you can actually either hold on to it or make the knight lose time, but there are some people who really know how to get you on this. So what I'll just do is just play here, regular Scandinavian style, and if he takes, I take back. If he pushes, I push here, and I'll get one of the Scandinavian setups without playing into his preparation. I really try to avoid playing into the opponent's preparation. Okay, that's it for move 2 alternatives. Now let's take a look. We said before that the next 3 moves for white are knight attacking, pawn taking the center, and the other knight coming out. Let's see what happens if he tries not doing it in the exact order that we said was best, knight to c3. But even before that, what about the other idea? Pawn here. Well, we said there's a concept for white to try to build a two-pawn center, but at this point in time, it just doesn't work. Strongest move on the board,
check.
Queen e4 check, giving white a whole bunch of crummy choices. Well, one of them is if he blocks with his queen, we're just going to trade queens, and this pawn, let's see what that looks like.
Check.
Basically, in this type of a setup, this pawn here is going to serve just to limit its own bishop. It's not going to do a whole lot. Yeah, he's going to get some. We're going to try to make sure he doesn't even get this pawn up 2 squares, and we can do that a bunch of ways with the knight here and a pawn here. It's a terrible setup. Black is at least equal. Let's say he blocks with this knight. Well, then we just grab a pawn here for free. And if he blocks with this bishop, we get a free pawn here. And the computer thinks that black is doing just great here. Now, this actually, I've seen people play this as a gambit, defending the rook and attacking with this. Queen runs back to here. And white actually has something of a lead in development and may actually get his two-pawn center. The computer is perfectly happy for black to have this and thinks that black can do this. I'm not a big fan of it. So, therefore, on this move here, I most often do not play queen e4 check. Maybe you can pull it off if you're a better tactician than I am. I just play queen here, and for white to be able to make this advance, the pawn is pinned right now. He has to play here first. I'll play this pawn 2 squares, and the computer agrees that white does not have a great game here because the advance of this pawn has just left the other pawn backwards on an open file. And it's not that hard for black to build up a lot of pressure against this square, and this pawn will never be able to move up 2. It'll just have to move up 1, and it'll be very limiting to what white can do with this pawn stuck here and here like this in this type of setup. So this is what I recommend on c4, is to play the queen to a5 and then a pawn to e5. And it just makes sense. Let's go back now, and we said, okay, the best move on the board is knight to c3, but what if white wants to just keep black guessing what's going to happen to the c-pawn, and he figures the next 2 moves are d4 or knight to f3. Maybe I could just play one of those 2 moves instead and leave black guessing about whether knight will be on c3 or pawn on c4. As it turns out, knight to f3 is a perfectly good move. When white plays this move now, either he's somebody who knows what he's doing and he is going to build that 2-pawn center. And look out, because it's a strong system. He might be doing that, or he might just be a player who thinks, I'm going to just develop my pieces. I don't have to play knight to c3 right away. So we're not sure who white is right now. Is he playing knight to f3 because he knows how to build the 2-pawn center, or because he just thinks he's going to develop naturally and play knight to c3 and move later? In any case, the best move on the board is bishop to g4. And if he knows what he's doing, he's going to play bishop to e2, castle, and he will build the 2-pawn center. That's a tough line to meet with a regular Scandinavian setup. That could be a topic of an entire video right there, how to play against this 3 knight to f3 bishop g4 system. But the correct move right now for white is bishop to e2. Let's say he just decides to switch gears and play knight to c3 right now. Well, that's something of a mistake, because then we have the move queen to e6 check. And this is kind of hard to meet, because if he blocks with the queen, we're going to trade queens, and have a very nice game. We're really not afraid of playing the Scandinavian as black once the queens come off the board that early. So queen here is very timid. And bishop here, which is probably what a lot of your opponents are going to play, leads to this, where this bishop is pinned. So there's just going to be this really crummy setup. Knight here is going to be next. And probably we're going to castle long no matter what white does. This is actually at least equal for black and is a really crummy way for white to play. So if he plays knight to f3, question is, after bishop g4, does he know about bishop e2? Even d4 is not that good because we can double up the pawns on and leave him with a pair of ugly pawns on f2. And knight to c3 is an outright mistake. But knight f3 on the third move is a perfectly fine move. Let's go back. So again, knight to c3 is the main move and the strongest. We could play queen a5. Knight to f3 is a pretty good move as well. And we're going to play bishop to g4. But let's just say d4. He doesn't want to be committal. He knows he wants to play a system with a pawn on d4, and he's going to leave us guessing whether this is coming next, or knight to c3, or bishop to, or knight to f3. He's leaving us guessing what he's going to do. Well, as it turns out, this is the weakest way for white to play. Again, he might be playing this thinking he wants to do a c4 pawn center, or he just wants to mix things up and play knight to c3 later. But leaving the queen here for one more move is kind of strong for black. And there's a couple of things he can do. I'll just show you one. He can play here right away. And now if white takes this pawn, we are not going to regain our pawn, but what we're going to do is
check.
We're going to make white lose his castling privilege, even though it cost us a pawn. Generally a really crummy idea, especially if the queen's off the board. But as it turns out here, black's pieces spring to life, and he will either regain the pawn, as he can do in many ways. He's already looking to regain the pawn here. If white plays f2 to f4, he probably can hold on to his pawn. Let's take a look and see how that would work. I'll just make some moves. And here's an idea against the f2 to f4 idea. We just throw away one more pawn and leave white with a really crummy setup. We're going to castle long and throw in another check. That's if he tries to hold on to the pawn for dear life by using another pawn. We're going to throw this one up. You could do it right away, actually. Let's say he doesn't. If he plays this move, we're already threatening to win the pawn by just taking here. Attacking this pawn. Again, this could be a whole other video, but it's not a great thing for white to take this pawn right now. So he could try other ideas, like developing against the queen, and it's a whole thing. Basically, black is going to give up the usual Scandinavian ideas and try to just go after putting a lot of pressure on this pawn, and the queen doesn't get chased away so easily. Now, if you don't want to learn all this at first, you're perfectly welcome to just play regular, and maybe he will play knight to c3 and will continue like regular. And in the worst case, you can just move your queen either here or here or here. These are all okay, and black is doing okay in these setups, but it's a little bit better for white. So if white knows you're a Scandinavian player and he plays for things like this, maybe you want to look these things up in a book and learn about them. Let's go back now. We look at third move alternatives for white. So we said d4 is not the strongest idea. Knight to c3 is. Now there's actually a gambit here. On the fourth move we said this is generally the best idea. There are some people that throw this gambit at you, and the idea is that if you take this pawn, the rook comes here, makes it hard for you to develop this bishop, and in some lines this bishop gets a very nice square here, aiming right down at the camp. Supposedly this is not a great idea, and black should be comfortable taking this pawn, but I don't. I just try to avoid his preparation.
Check.
Throw in a check. He's not going to block with his queen. Make my escape hatch. Knight is going to hit me. Come back here. And after this, I'm going to play regular Scandinavian moves. Get my bishop out, push up a pawn, etc., etc., etc. Let's see what else we have here before we go on to the actual traps. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the real trap lines that we can run into. And most of them have to do, as I said before, with the bishop g4 idea that I was showing you earlier. So let's take a look at this. And knight c3, this goes here, pawn to d4, knight to f3. Now, this may seem silly, but a lot of times in speed chess, you will see a move like bishop to g5, where the queen just chops it off. But let's say the guy's not quite that crazy. What you're more likely to see is knight to f3, and now he does it. And now after any bishop move whatsoever, here for example, we just chop this off, queen takes back, and then this is kind of like more of a blitz chess move or the under 1500 set, but you will see it, and it's good to just, you don't want to pass up on something like this. By the way, even if after bishop g4 he plays bishop e2 like this, we still are going to win a piece. If he recaptures, we grab the queen. If he throws this in first, we take one more here, attacking the queen. And again, we're up a piece. So that's something to look out for. That's our second and third trap, or maybe our fourth. I kind of lost count myself. Let's take a look at a couple other things that come out of this system. Remember, we play pawn to c6 here. And now let's see what happens if we go a little further. This many moves, a lot of your opponents are going to know by heart. And now bishop g4, the move I recommend. Let's take a look and see what happens. This is the most common place to safely develop the bishop and also have all sorts of shtick when the knight moves out of the way. Well, we have to boldly play and not be afraid. Do not move your queen. We play pawn to e6 to continue our development. And now, knight to d5. He can do that. It's protected by the bishop, so the queen can't grab it, and this queen is under attack. There's only one square to go to, and that's here. And now, the knight takes the knight. It's got no place else to go. Queen takes knight, and bishop here looks incredibly powerful because our queen is under attack from this bishop, and there are not a lot of good places to go. We're pretty darn close to zero, maybe here or here. I'm not even sure those work, but as it turns out, this is a trap. And after the bishop takes the knight here, it's white who's in some serious trouble. Let's take a look and see what his choices are and how they all are no good. We just grabbed a piece. If either the queen takes the bishop or this pawn takes the bishop, we grab this bishop here. We are now a piece up. So these two choices are wrong, and white can resign. What about grabbing a queen? How bad could you go if you take a queen? Now we take a queen. Now white can grab that bishop, and we can take this one, and we're a whole piece up. Or white can run away with his bishop, and we can run away with our bishop. Again, we're a whole piece up. So let's take a look at that again, because this is going to happen. After this much development, white goes here, attack on the queen, we come back, knight takes knight check, queen takes knight, and on bishop g5, we just chop this off. And in almost every variation, whether the bishop is recaptured this way or that, or he takes the queen, we are an entire piece up. As a matter of fact, let's take a look. The correct move, there is a way out of this for white to not have to resign. And it goes like this. He has to play his queen here, a move that almost nobody would think of. And that way he's protecting his bishop. The attack is still on my bishop, and I have to move. So after that move, this queen goes here to f5. He takes back with a tattered pawn structure, and if white is even smart enough to find this queen d2 move, it's very, very hard to find over the board. Almost nobody can find it, because it just seems like you must capture something when there are 1, 2, 3 choices of what to capture. So that is our 6th trap. And now let's look at our final trap for this video. And let's see, it begins like this. Oh yes. Okay, so from here, if instead of doing the knight move, he first drives this bishop back. Let's take a look at that. Let's see here. We're going to go back to the beginning. It's not letting us do that. Okay, well, it's a good review. Scandinavian, knight to c3 hitting book move delta 4, book move knight to f6, knight to f3, Charlie 6, bishop to c4, the strongest square. Then comes our move. Let's say in this line he's going to play h3. We're going to play pawn to echo 6, and now he breaks the pin now, taking away a lot of our trickery of bishop takes knight. And now, on move 10, he throws in the knight to d5 idea. Then when we come back, now what? Now we're really out of squares, completely out. And there's no bishop takes knight. It looks like he can resign, and I actually saw in a game between two masters, black resigned. But he doesn't have to resign. He's doing just fine after bishop takes here. And now, if the queen grabs this bishop, we grab the knight and all is good. But let's say he doesn't, and he goes here instead. Well, first we can throw in a nice little check here, which is kind of uncomfortable. And then we can go to a square over here, because we're all protected. And you might want to play this one over again, look at it with a computer, but it holds up. Let's take a look at that again. The knight takes, the queen takes, bishop, no squares for the queen, but bishop takes c2. And now if the queen takes, we'll grab this knight here. And if the queen does the correct thing, to move out of the way of the bishop and still protect his knight, We have a nasty little check, and then we move to safety. So we're doing just fine here as black. And let's go back to the beginning, and let's look at another. This is some essential Scandinavian. This is going to be the final trap of our video. This should look familiar by now. Pawn to c6 before we develop our bishop. Bishop to c4. If he develops it anyplace else, we're perfectly happy to do the same thing. And now, these are considered the strongest moves for white, and they are. The knight picks up at commanding post, and now watch what happens. Now things start to look a little scary for black. If white knows what he's doing and he's an aggressive, strong player, he pushes his pawn one more time, threatening to snuff out your bishop by moving the pawn one more time. If you make an escape hatch by lifting up this pawn, your position falls apart in ruins. It's almost resignable. Luckily, Scandinavian defense works. You do not have to do that. All you have to do is remember this little line here. We're just going to develop our other knight. And now let's take a look and see what happens. We've played 10 moves, and pretty much we have two attackers on this knight. If he doesn't do something, we're going to take pawn takes, queen takes with check, and we're winning. Let's take a look and see 3 things that white might do and how they all fail. What he should do is take off your knight and then you take back. Let's take a look at that. And if he tries to squash you now, we come in here, and because of the pin on the knight, we're okay. We're attacking the rook, and then we can just tuck ourselves back on this square right here. And we've gone 13 moves into the opening, which is pretty much the end of an opening. But let's say he doesn't do that. That is the best line of play. 3 things that people will do besides that. Well, number 1 is they'll actually just try this squash move right here. And if they do that, you just take off this knight. And if he takes back with the pawn, as we said, the queen takes, check, and then the bishop can run over here. But let's say he takes your bishop instead. You take this piece, which is hanging loose. And let's see the analysis. Pawn takes check, king takes, and according to the computer, black is ahead by 2 full pawns worth. Oh, he actually has, because he picked up that extra piece over here, the bishop on c4. So let's go back and look at this again. Playing the move pawn to h5 is not good. We just boldly ignore it and chop off his knight. What else might he do? Well, he might say he wants to keep this knight in its commanding position so he could bring this queen here, put an extra protector on it. What do we do now? Well, the computer says we're ahead by like a pawn and a half here by just taking here, and he's not going to take with the queen. Well, we can take a look at that. If he takes with the queen, if he takes with the queen, we would trade queens, pawn would take, knight would come back here, attacking this pawn, and the bishop would be attacking that one. So he takes with the pawn, and now we go here, where we've got this nasty pin on the knight. And no matter what he does, well, first of all, he's going to worry about us taking this pawn here with the queen. Let's say he does something like this. Knight takes. This is very bad. This is very bad. You can go over this with your computer, but this is bad. And then after this swapping here, we can make a way out, pushing this pawn 2 squares. Knight takes d2. Let's see how they're showing it. Why not take with the king? Because if you take with the queen, I would think you just take right here, check. And you can, and you are up material. So that's the second idea that doesn't work, is to defend the knight a second time with the queen. And the third idea is to reinforce it with a pawn. And let's see how we blow that out of the water. And the way we do it is by playing knight takes. And no matter which way he recaptures, with this pawn or that pawn, our next move is to come here and do stuff to this knight. And any move that's taken to defend over here, we have the best move according to the computer is here, which helps defend, and then we can just play the pawn up like this, and all is fine. And this is probably the best of the bad ideas. This only gives a 1 pawn advantage to black, just slightly less than a pawn for black in this line. Okay, so let's just run through that one more time and wrap up this video. So this is the line where we're in the basic idea. On our 6th move, we play a bishop out here, and we don't just swap away the bishop for the knight. We back up, bring those pawns forward. At this point, we develop with pawn to echo 6. And if he tries to squash us with the h-pawn, which many people will do, we just challenge his knight. And what black is saying is, you think advancing those pawns is an advantage, maybe they're going to become under fire and they'll actually become weak and lose touch with their protectors on the other side of the board. Probably the line you're going to see the most from here is the push like that, in which case we just take this, and I think we're going to be, well, if he takes this bishop here, we'll be up a piece. What's his best? His best move is to just be down like a pawn by taking here, check, blocks, and bishop here, all is fine. And it is black who is up about a pawn and a half, according to the analysis that you see here. Okay, so there's a whole lot here. You don't have to pick it all up at once. Start off by just getting the basic ideas of how you develop your pieces in the Scandinavian. You can look through on databases like 365chess.com. Most of the information you're going to find is going to be not about the line I've shown with bishop g4, but the bishop to f5 variation. So just build slowly, and you'll see you can learn more and more about this opening over a period of years, but this is a really good head start. I hope you liked the video.